I think that Richard was 200% authentic. And I think that's what probably everybody in this room responds to. Finally, when that person, knowing nothing about art, would walk into the studio, right away they'd reach in their pocket.
To give a bit of background, I was introduced to Nemo when we first started, probably about 2015, 2016. The studio was looking quite cool, but nowhere near where it is today. And I always said to myself, as I said to you earlier, that I had this gut feeling that I would do some kind of business or something with you. Number one, because you're a great guy. Two, that you got a lot of experience. And more importantly, you've been connected to some of the elite artists. Andy Warhol, you knew, Jean-Michel Basquiat, Keith Haring, and obviously Hambleton. And you've got a wealth of other great artists that you're connected to. Yeah, I mean, look, for me, every time I watch that documentary, it moves me. I'm not from the art market, as I've always said. But the moment I watched it, I felt compelled, I felt moved, and I felt it was my calling. What we're trying to do as a brand, tell the Hambleton legacy, educate the audience. Because I feel that your taste is always shaped by your education. The moment you get educated, you feel compelled to be a part of the movement. Would you say that's true?
Absolutely. And as we see by the film, Richard would have been the last person to educate anybody. He was so caught up in his craft that he forgot to stand on his own soapbox and proclaim himself a genius. So if it weren't for people like you and all the things that you guys have been doing, I wish actually there were more people doing that type of work. But if nobody else but you, I'm glad that, his legacy is being lived out in a meaningful way after his passing, because I think he's the sort of artist that had a lot more to say than meets the eye. The fact that I could see his paintings basically every day for the past 30 years, and today walk into your studio and see things that just move me almost to tears, and then to see the film I've seen already and again. So, yeah, there's a lot of meat on the bone there,
So for those of you who don't know, I run a podcast, Steve is Sully's Study, and Nemo's been a guest of mine, and I've asked him some really, really good questions about the Hambleton market. Just to recap on some of those points then, how did you get involved? How did you get connected to Richard Hambleton?
First and foremost, my father and myself, and even my grandfather going back, were real dyed-in-the-wool bohemians. So we're not exactly businessmen as such, and I always kind of avoid business whenever I'm able to. And so my father was working with him pretty directly. I wouldn't say Richard was so much charity case, because he always seemed like he was going to figure out somehow his difficulties. But my father was always there for Richard. Oh, I need rent, or whatever his excuses for needing, a bag full of money. And my father was all too happy to provide it. But Richard often would zig when he should have zagged, and disappointed a lot of people who just wanted a straight business deal with him. And, Richard was unable to draw a straight line through anything. So at some point, my dad would get frustrated with him, and then Richard would call me. And, hey, Nemo, your dad's not returning my call. And I was like, yeah, with good reason. But he would somehow talk me into helping him pay rent that month or whatever. So I was kind of a, pitch hitter or whatever. And little by little, I became dragged into his spell. He could be a very charming bastard, and he kind of got me wrapped around his finger too. So it was much more than business, because honestly, I feel like I ended up with the short end of the stick business-wise. But the memories and the fondness that I grew towards him, that's the invaluable part of actually watching the man work and seeing his process, and things that can't even be translated even by a great film like that. That's the invaluable thing for me.
So part of the mission and the goal when I started the podcast, certainly when I'm talking to anyone affiliated to the Hambleton market, was to uncover stories that haven't been told. So you connected me to Richard Hambleton's dentist. As you could see with the documentary, Hambleton, in my mind, was the richest but poorest person. And what I mean by that is his assets were worth a lot of money, but he didn't have a lot of cash. So he would go into a hotel, he would go into a barber shop, he would go into the dentist, and to pay his way for the services, he would paint. So you connected me with a guy called Dr. Norman Turkovitz. And some of the paintings he's got from the services he gave Hambleton and the stories are unbelievable. I mean, I'm not going to spoil it, but if you go onto my podcast and listen to that particular interview, I mean, there's some crazy stories there. So my goal is to tell these untold stories that are not on the documentary or been recorded before. And one of the questions I got here from the email that we sent out to our client database is, have you got any stories from the 80s that maybe that your father knew, that you knew about, some of the stuff that he was doing back in the 80s, stuff that the documentary hasn't highlighted?
First things first, because you said a few interesting things before you actually dropped the question on us, is that that dentist, my father was the one who set the two of them up together, because Richard obviously wasn't first in hygiene. So sometimes teeth would be rotting out of his head and he had to be dragged to the dentist. So luckily my father knew a root canal specialist, and Barry Musicant was one of the top root canal people in the city. And in the early 70s, my dad, for treatment, offered this dentist Andy Warhol soup can. And the guy said no. He said, no, I want $1,200 or whatever it is. So
I bet he's kicking himself now.
Yeah, and so he said, for the rest of you guys' life, whatever art you bring me, I'm taking it. So Dr. Turkowitz is a friend of his and on in that tradition. So, and the funny thing is with Richard is using the art itself as a means of bartering rather than turning it first into cash. I doubt any of his pharmaceutical suppliers were savvy enough to take art for product, but he managed to turn trade around very quickly. And I remember one time a restaurateur was building a restaurant, and it's a time when Richard was pretty flush with cash, which was rare. But I brought him into the restaurant. They wanted him to paint on the wall, and Richard was happy to do it. And when we started talking money, he started shifting around in his seat. He said, nah, I don't really need money. I want to do this, but we need to come to terms that work for me. And the restaurateur looked at me, and then he looked at Richard. He goes, I'll tell you what, I'll give you 200 free meals or whatever. And Richard's eyes lit up. He said, yes, I want that. And that's what the deal we went on. He was just happy that he knew he had a free meal in his pocket whenever he wanted to. I don't think he ever cashed in one of them, and he did a really beautiful painting. So that's really Richard for you, is that I guess fundamentally that's called alchemy. He converted his base feelings into gold through making this art, and rather than change that back into money, which would cheapen the deal, he just got the service that he wanted out of life.
There's no doubt that there's a big connection between Banksy and also Richard Hambleton. In the last few weeks at Sotheby's, a record auction was set at £18.3 million by Banksy. Mm-hmm. And many say that Hambleton, without knocking Banksy, is a true artist. He would go over to a wall, and whatever he was feeling at the time, he would kind of attack the wall with a lot of energy. So how do you see Hambleton's market unfolding over the next few years? Do you think it could be as big as Banksy, or do you think it could be bigger?
Without having a crystal ball or understanding all the market-savvy things people can do to boost prices, I think that Richard was 100%, 200% authentic. And I think that's what probably everybody in this room responds to. And I could bring people, like some of those times Richard would call me and say, I need rent, I owe rent. I said, Richard, we just paid rent. Well, I need next month's rent, whatever his story would be. Sometimes I bring a fashion model or a filmmaker or a trust fund kid. Sometimes I bring a pot dealer over to him. And it's people that generally weren't acquainted with art. And I'd be sitting in the taxi telling them about him, and we'd buzz Richard, and he wouldn't come right down. And finally, when that person, knowing nothing about art, would walk into the studio, right away they'd reach in their pocket and they'd take money out. he just made an instant convert out of people because, you know, he was just so genuine that you just had a knee-jerk reaction at once. You'd respond to his authenticity. So again, like you, not knocking Banksy or Cause or any of these so-called street artists that have made a, you know, killing in the business world. Richard, I think, last night, I guess I'm still jet lagged, and I was watching a thing about Caravaggio, and a barber gave a police report on Caravaggio as a witness and said Caravaggio is one of those men who wears black after the Vespers bell, meaning he's a rogue or somebody that might mug you in an alley. And it harkened to me like what Richard's shadows meant. You know, that sinister thing that's always lurking in the streets late at night. No matter, I don't care if you're a congressman or a martial artist, you know, there's some threatening elements in the inner city. And I think so long as we walk through the streets, we're going to feel like those shadows of Richard looking after us. So I don't think that's going to disappear anytime soon. And I think that there's a reason when Italy had the lira notes, their biggest denomination, I think, was 500,000 lira? Yeah. And it wasn't Michelangelo, it wasn't Leonardo da Vinci or Raphael, it was Caravaggio. And I think we as a people, we like good guys, but I think something in us, we favor the underdog, meaning we like the bad guy. And Richard is that bad guy for our time. You know, he's certainly not well-behaved or crossing his T's or dotting his I's as some of these other more successful entities are. And I think it's taken people like yourself and Andy Valmorbida and Vladimir Reutfeld and even Mr. Armani to help push and do the things that Richard would never have done for himself. But I think it's all going to fall in its place and history will remember him.
You spoke about shadow figures. He's known for the shadow figures. Of course, the Shadowman documentary, that's what he's known for. But obviously he done things like the Shadow Hearts, the Cats, landscapes, the rodeos. What would you say is probably his most sought-after works?
I hope I'm not repeating myself. I think you asked something similar in the podcast, and I said that Andy Warhol in his lifetime had a lot of difficulty selling the electric chairs, the skulls, I believe also the car accidents, the more morbid works. And now those are some of the most expensive in his life's work. And I think if you take a series like the Beautiful series, I think people say, oh, that's not hard and edgy, it looks too lyrical and picturesque. In fact, when you look into it, there's a lot of rugged reality behind those as well. But I think those will have their day, and maybe it takes a book to be written by a proper art scholar or something to that end. But I don't know. I've never really seen a bad Hambleton. And I think it goes for the rodeo series, the Cats, the Hearts. Some of those, when you're in their presence, they'll break your heart. I mean, he really dealt with a depth of and a range of emotion. So I think there's, literally something for everybody there.
So the New York Times is famous calling Hambleton the Godfather of street art. And to be honest, that's the thing that hooked me. Mm-hmm. When I heard that, I'm not from the art market again, but it doesn't take, let's say, an art expert to work out that if this guy is really the Godfather of street art, he's going to become somebody eventually. Since then, the New York Times recently, in the last week to two, have done another big publication about Hambleton. And part of that publication was talking about the reappearance of these shadow figures. So there's been a bit of kickback on that. There's been a lot of people for it. And thanks to my connections, I managed to track down the masked artist, the mysterious guy who wouldn't give me his name. It's like a Banksy-esque type interview, which comes out this Wednesday. And I wanted to find out why he started redoing these shadow figures. What's your take on that?
Well, at first, I had my doubts, being something of a purist. And just to go off of subject a bit, at first, there's an artist in New York City who I have a soft spot for, but he's a difficult personality, and he's known for forging a Jean-Michel Basquiat painting, and he went to jail for it. And recently he was giving a talk about it at Neue House, one of our arts institutions, and he asked me to present him. And I said, you know, I really can't side with a forger. But if you watch F for Fake, which is Orson Welles' film, it brings up some very interesting questions about which is more properly called appropriation in art. And so long as these things aren't passed off as the original work of Richard Hambleton, in other words, oh, we discovered some walls that Richard Hambleton himself had painted on. Well, I think it's fine because, and this idea only has grown on me in time, because at first I was against it. It wasn't Richard, he didn't do it. But now I'm of the feeling that, first of all, it's a shame that the original Shadowmen are no longer with us in the streets of New York. So it's nice to have somebody reinstitute those sinister countenances all across our city. Second of all, first they're his fingerprint gesture, his DNA that goes into an artwork that's purely his own, which is Richard Hambleton original. But then there's another conceptual element to it. Just that there is a shadow painted on the street. And I think that there could be a small army of people doing those around the world, and it would be fine with me. That there should be shadows lurking out there, and they should be watching over us, because I think people get a little bit content with their lives and shopping and going to restaurants and going to the cinema, and they forget that there's this kind of nitty-gritty realities out there. So Richard, whatever successes he may have enjoyed, was always part of that nitty-gritty reality. And at this point, I feel like if somebody wants to carry on that part of the legacy, more power to them.
So with my podcast, I'm quite persistent. I've been called a pest and annoying because I keep on badgering certain guests to get on my podcast, and eventually I wear them down. And the main person I was trying to track down, apart from the Hambleton Foundation, of course, was the Oscar-nominated director Oren Jacobi for The Shadowman. And eventually when I got him and pinned him down, one of the main questions I asked him was, is the documentary going to be turned into a Hollywood movie? And his answer was yes. Now, if someone like a Brad Pitt, a Johnny Depp, someone of that ilk were to play Hambleton, that would be absolutely groundbreaking. How do you feel about a Hollywood movie coming out for Hambleton?
Well, if you look at, all right, for instance, I participated in the film about Jean-Michel Basquiat that was directed by Julian Schnabel. And all the society people were fine with it, but a lot of the street kids that used to hang around Basquiat said to me, Nemo, why do you want to be part of that? Julian and Jean-Michel were mortal enemies on some level. I said, well, it's a piece of history, and if I can tell my part with honesty, then I'm not concerned with the larger picture. And as far as I'm concerned, Julian ended up creating a beautiful film that really galvanized a whole new generation to follow in the footsteps of Basquiat that otherwise may never have heard of him. And furthermore, there's about 100 films about Billy the Kid. It's just a great story. And one Billy the Kid is played by James Stewart, and one is played by Ronald Reagan. It doesn't matter. There's enough story there to be told and retold from a lot of different perspectives. So by all means, I think a film about Hambleton is overdue, and I think there should be more than one.
So on the note of the film or documentary, it's important to mention that this Shadowman documentary, which is on Amazon Prime, won an award at the Tribeca Film Festival. What was that like, the Tribeca?
I feel like I was at the New York Film Festival screening. Did it? Maybe it was Tribeca.
How the other half live, eh?
Yeah.
I can't even remember where you were.
No, okay, so I believe it was at the Tribeca. Okay, it was at Tribeca, and we all did our best to cajole Hambleton himself into attending. And for whatever reason, he was sort of the opposite of a glory hog. He would get very shy, and you see it in those film clips, like My father was the one to drag him to the Phillips event with Andy and Vlad. Richard didn't want to come. I think partly because of his vanity, because he felt his face was starting to fall apart and he didn't want to be seen by all those pretty women in that way. But I think that Richard also wanted to stay home at that screening. And I don't know who was responsible for bringing him there that day, but we were in the audience and he came in the back of the cinema and he showed up for about 2 minutes and then he left. And I was like, I hope he's not disappointed that we all got together and did this. But when I spoke to him later, he seemed like he felt honored by it. But that kind of colored my experience. Understand, Steve? While I was there, I was like, what if Richard hates this? What if Richard... So now this is the first time I'm watching it sort of guilt-free. And I can't see how anybody would have not appreciated this film.
So let me ask a question which might be a little bit tough, but I'm going to stick it on you. What is in your art portfolio as far as Hambleton's concerned? Come on, the audience wants to know.
I have a few things, but they're like, I think I mentioned this to you earlier. Jean-Michel Basquiat drew some things for me in his lifetime, just from an older artist to a young fan or friend or whatever you would have called me. They're things I would never sell. Late in his life, I don't know if it was probably after he was staying at the Trump Hotel, he crashed at my house for 2 days, it seemed like 2 weeks. And him and his girlfriend and 17 suitcases sprawled out, looked like a murder scene, and syringes and all kinds of things. And they would make these concoctions, I think, tuna fish and coffee soup or some crazy thing. You couldn't think that stuff up in a horror movie, the way they lived. And they would sit and watch cartoons and chain smoke cigarettes all day. But one of the things he did before he left is he drew a beautiful shadow on the back of my door, the door that leads to the hallway of my apartment. And the peephole that you would look into the hallway is the eye of this shadow. And I'm not exaggerating. If somebody said, I'll give you $1 million cash right now, I just wouldn't be moved to take it because that's my front door. And it was blessed by, my departed friend. So, I have a few things, but I don't think they're things I'd ever want to turn into money.
So there's obviously the Hollywood movie coming out. There's the Richard Hambleton Experience, which is taking place next year and traveling the world. It's going to finish in Canada, where Hambleton was born. And then there's a few other things taking place. How do you see the next 12, 24 months, maybe 3 or 4 years unfolding?
With regards to the growth of Richard's...
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess there's different energy centers that are forming around Richard. Some of them are more, we're the custodians of the true tradition of his life. We were his friends, or we're the business people that know how to put him on Main Street or what. So every once in a while, I'll visit with these groups, and everywhere I've been asked, where do you see Richard's legacy going? I think it's a rising star. And some people would say that it's a shame that it didn't happen as well in his own lifetime. He was the number one reason it didn't happen in his own lifetime. He really didn't want that sort of success. He wanted to be marginalized so he could just be in his studio focused on what he did for all of us. But I think as far as like it's in that regard, it really follows the model of Van Gogh's life, where he did what he did. He put all of his full commitment into it. And after the fact, Theo, his brother, who was an art dealer, and the art world got together on, and they said, the world needs to see Van Gogh's work. And I remember, Van Gogh couldn't sell a painting in his lifetime, and I remember going to his retrospective in Amsterdam. It must have been 1991. There was a line around the block, Chinese and African and European. Everybody was there. And I think it wouldn't be unlikely if in 50 years that were the case with Hambleton. Hopefully it won't take that long, but I see everybody who gets exposed gets the fever.
What came first, the murder series back in the 70s and 80s, or was it I Only Have Eyes for You?
you're exposing my ignorance that I've never read about him or studied about him at all. And an idiot that looked at Wikipedia might know a lot more about the arc of his career than I do. I only know what I have firsthand information of. So I remember seeing outline chalk figures in the street, and to my memory, those predated ever having seen the shadow. And because we were graffiti artists growing up, it was really the shadow that we would call him that. We'd say, oh, the Shadowman, because we didn't know him as Richard Hambleton. There was, anonymously, there were shadows popping up. So we'd say, oh, the Shadowman was here last night. And yeah, I believe it was the DOA series first, and then he started putting the figures around. That, to my knowledge, that's the way it went. But again, a cursory look at a history book may prove me a fool for saying that.
So there was, in the documentary mentioned, in 1983, the International Herald Tribune wrote about Hambleton, Jean-Michel Basquiat, and Keith Haring, and they said there was a surge in demand and interest in street art. Back then, it was probably more known as graffiti, but it was becoming a genre. And out of the three, Jean-Michel Basquiat was actually the least sort of qualified. A piece of his was only going for about $10,000, and Keith Haring or Hambleton was going back for around about $15,000. The irony is, the one that was the least favourite almost, in 2017, one of his pieces in auction went for $110.5 million. Now, you knowing street art, you knowing Hambleton, Haring, Basquiat, how did that make you feel when you saw a piece fetch $110.5 million for one piece of artwork?
I probably was in the minority of people that expected that well in advance of it ever taking grip on the public, because my father had a very good understanding of art history. And, you know, my father used to sell modern and contemporary art for a living, and I would go with him up on Madison Avenue and look at Picasso's and Morandi or Leger or Chagall. And because I was involved with graffiti, it was through my need to be around the graffiti art movement that my father first started going sort of to the other side of the tracks. And as soon as my dad, well, maybe not as soon as he saw the graffiti artists, but after a while of being immersed in that through me, because, I was a kid. I was 10, 11, 12 years old. And in order to go to the fun gallery or the danceteria, my dad would actually have to bring me to these things. Very early on, my dad would tell me and the artists themselves, hey, you guys are sitting on a gold mine. This is all going to take root. And then my dad would explain to me the way the beatniks, you know, the bebop jazz and beat poetry and abstract expressionism they were ghetto movements at some part themselves, that he watched those become part of the canon. So he recognized very early that would happen with the street art. And I think it's still just beginning.
I asked you on my podcast about New York. I'm quite intrigued by it, and I've asked a few of the artists who are from New York about the scenes and also the environment and the culture back in the 70s and 80s in New York, the Bronx and different parts. Was it really as sketchy and as controversial as the documentary made out?
I think it was worse. I mean, your life was literally in your hands whenever you left your door, whether you realized it or not. Or shoot, in the case of home invasions, it was in jeopardy even when you were at home watching television. With the drug revolution and the drug trade, and there were crackheads that were like zombies lurking on the street. And it's not like heroin junkies that can't harm a fly because they're nodding out. I mean, crackheads are really in a frenzied state. So, yeah, the world I grew up in the 80s, late 70s, early 80s, inner city was really a battleground. It's very different than the world of today, where you really have to go into the so-called ghetto to be exposed to any type of threat. But back then, even if you were in Greenwich Village or in Soho, there could be, you know, little bands of like pirates roaming the plains. And yeah, it was a hostile environment.
So even though we would never promote the use of drugs and alcohol, etc., we can't escape the fact that the environment, the culture, heroin, crack cocaine, drinking, this all kind of factored into Hambleton's personality. Do you think he would have been as great as he is or was without that and having a bit more of a clean lifestyle?
There's no way to know that. I mean, you know, like in Charlie Parker's time, jazz musicians knew that he was not only the greatest, but he was also the worst heroin addict out there. And they said in order to play like Bird, you got to be like Bird. Like you have to be a heroin addict to really get that depth of feeling. And we all know that abstract expressionists were more drunks, but they were a little bit from an older time. The beat poets definitely experimented with all kinds of substances. And I think that Richard was sort of the last in that tradition of just, Basquiat, I think my dad said in the film, Basquiat looked like a Boy Scout with his drug use compared with Richard. To my understanding, Basquiat never really developed that sort of habit. Where Richard, there were times, you know, I needed Richard to do something and he'd be like, okay, I'll do it, but I need $300. You have to come to my house. I'd give him the money. I'd wait for him. A shady-looking character would go in, and Richard would come out half hour later all fired up. Okay, come on, let's go do it. It was like something he needed to get right. But if he's any example, I drove some jazz musicians on tour. The bassist, William Parker, who was Cecil Taylor's bassist for many years, I drove him on tour. And I'm sorry, but to my ear, he played every bit as good jazz as Charlie Parker or any of them. And I would ask him that question. Do you think Charlie Parker needed the drugs to get high? Now, William Parker is somebody who never drank liquor, never smoked a joint. First woman he kissed and last woman he kissed was his wife. And he said, no, music, it just comes from within us. And we have to find where it comes from. And once you have that, that door is always open. Now, that said, if Steve, you feel you need that door to be open with a little help, you know, more power to you. But I suppose it could be accessed just organically.
If I were to ask you the best quality of Richard Hambleton, what would you say?
His sweetness. I mean, when he looked in your eyes, like there were times I was like, this bastard's ripping me off. Or I'd go down there, want to punch him in his nose. And he'd look at me and it's like, he had this like childlike wonder in his eyes. His eyes would just sparkle with light when he looked at you. And you're like, you know, this guy, he's just so innocent somewhere in his heart. And I think that was the place he was coming from with all that artwork, that he never let up. It was like an inexhaustible stream of creativity, the same way what a child has, you know? So I would say that was it. Yeah, his sweetness.
And polar opposite question, what was his worst quality?
I mean, he would steal cream out of coffee. I mean, he just like, you just couldn't do a straight deal with the guy. And, you know, I would tell him, hey, Richard, I got $10,000 for you. I'm coming tomorrow. I want that painting. And you come and the painting be gone. You'd already given him the deposit. Oh yeah, somebody came and you know, he'd give you some cockamamie story. You just want to, I hate to say it, you want to strangle him. But yeah, he was a menace to society, but what a beautiful gift to society as well.
I interviewed a big collector, a guy called Ken Moss, who's got, you know, he's taken a few companies public. He's a very successful man. He's been to the studio a few times, and he said the number one advice, if you ever bought anything off of Hambleton, take it there and then. Oh, yeah. Because if not, it would either be destroyed or completely redone. Oh, and sometimes it would turn out good. Sometimes it would just be destroyed.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it was all in the moment with him. And, yeah, if you had to deal with him, you had to make it then and there. Yeah.
Last question. Advice. If someone's getting into the market for the first time, whether they got a hat on of a collector, an investor, a fanatic, what would be your number one advice?
Well, I forget the name of the collectors, but there's a documentary I watched recently about big art collectors. I believe they bought Rauschenberg, Liechtenstein, people from that era, and multi-millionaire collectors, a couple. I think they were from Brooklyn originally. He was a taxi driver. So one of the things I feel is that people that feel like art is a rich person's game, yes, it's thanks to rich people for the most part that art is kept hermetically safe throughout the ages. It's because of institutions, it's because of kings, it's because of museums that were made as like a shrine to art. But you're never too poor to start collecting art. And that I think, if you can't afford a Hambleton, perhaps at this point, there's people out there that are plugging away and they're making real things happen in our time today that, would be lucky to see $100 or $500. But I think, every once in a while, I see something that's a bit out of my reach as a collector. And if I really have that feeling like I go home and I'm regretting not buying the thing, I'll call either the artist, if it was at an artist studio or if it was at a gallery, and I'll be like, look, I'll give you something today. Let me hold that piece, and I'm going to make it right with you. So I think to really follow your passions, not blindly, I don't think we should follow our passions to the point where we're buying things just from a feeling and it's something that has no chance of ever appreciating in value. But if you really feel strongly about it, I think nobody should call themselves too poor to start collecting. And I think if you take that attitude, I think in time it will make you rich. I mean, just quickly, I know we're wrapping up, but my father came from nothing. I mean, absolutely nothing. And he had a maybe third grade education, except what he taught himself from being an avid reader. And, son of Sicilian immigrants. And he got involved with Andy Warhol from 1960 and other people, and he made a good life for himself. And I think that art has a way of finding a home for everybody that is sincere about pursuing it.
Thank you for your time, mate. You've been an absolute gent. Thank you. I hope everyone enjoyed that, and we'll be at the bar. Thank you.